Hey, what's up everyone? My name is Zach Lawley. I'm a project manager here at 5 Words Media, and I am here with an Allen and Heath SQ5. So one thing we really need to know before we start really diving into this thing is what all these buttons do under the screen. That's kind of your main navigation for how you get around this console. The first button is our processing button. We talked about a lot about that when we went through our preamp, our high pass filter, our EQ, our gate, and our compressor. That, when you select an input, it pulls up an 8-channel overview of whatever 8 channels you have selected. So if I select my first 8 channels, I get all my drums and my snare verb. If I select my last 8 channels, of course, we talked about how I set up my DCAs there, so I see an overview of my DCAs and what's in each DCA. Same thing if I go down to my outputs, I can see that and I can select all of my outputs and stuff. The processing button is something you're probably gonna be in 90% of the time while you're mixing. Your second button is routing. We talked about that when we were talking about patching the console. Same thing, if you select a channel and you hit routing, you see an 8-channel overview of where that input is headed. You can see your DCA and your mute group assignments. You can see your left-right send and how much it's sending to your left-right fader. You see your mix sends and your effect sends. Within this 8-channel bank, you can select each individual channel and get a bigger image of what you're seeing in the channel strip. The next button is meters. You can see your input meters here, your effects meters, your send and returns, your mix meters, your USB meters, so what's coming into the console from your USB, or what's leaving the console from the USB. You can get an RTA, which is an analyzer to see what frequencies are at. You can select that from being an individual channel or your main left-right. So if you don't have a system like Smart or any of those other RTA softwares, you can use that here. And then you have your channel meters. Here you can actually change your channel meter colors. This is the only console I know where you could do that, where you can change your channel meter colors to be what you want them to be. The next button is your effects button. We're not going to dive too deep into this. If you're interested more in effects, see our video on the effects. But this is the button you would go to when you want to see all of your effects in one spot and want to dive into each one of them. The next is your scenes. This is where you would save your scene. You would recall a scene maybe from a USB drive, or you would store your scene to your USB drive. Here you can also set filters up so only certain things get saved and certain things don't get saved. And you can set your safes up here so individual inputs, your effects, or your mixes don't get recalled. That's really nice if you have an input like a pastor mic or a host mic or an emergency mic that you need to stay on your console at all times. The next button is your setup button. There's a lot in here, so let's start going over it. First tab on the left is your audio tab. You have your PAFL, which stands for Pre-Audio Fade Listen. This is where you can decide what's going to your headphone output or maybe a mix output if you're mixing monitors on this board. Dive into here if you need to be specific on this. The next is TalkBack. Here you can decide where your TalkBack is getting routed into the console and where it's going out of the console. You can also control a few things like a high pass filter, your latch, your trim, and your gain, all from this page. The next one is SIG-Gen. It stands for Signal Generator. This is where you can send a sine wave or pink noise or white noise out of the console. If you need to test speakers or anything of that nature where you need to send pink noise, this is where you would do that from. The next one is Audio Sync. This is where you would select your clock source. Ours is set to internal because this is the only console we have, but maybe you have multiple consoles hooked up to a network, and so this is where you would choose that. This is also where you would choose your sample rate. The next is your I/O port. Your I/O port is the card slot on the back, whether it's a Waves card, a Dante card, a MADI card, or an S-Link card. This is where you would go to control that card. I don't have one plugged in, so obviously there's nothing there. And then lastly is USB. This is where you can choose your sample rate and USB modes. Next, we have your surface. We talked about this a lot in layout. And so this is where you can do your strip assignments for all 6 of your layers that are on the side right here. This is also where you would control all of your soft buttons and soft rotaries. You can also plug a foot switch into the back of this. So if you wanted to set it up to be a tap tempo or maybe to change scenes off of a foot switch, you could do that here as well. And then the last one is your surface preferences. This is where you could control your LED brightness, your delay units and how they get read out to you, and different options like what pops up on the screen and when. Next down, you have mixer config. This is where you would choose where you want your inputs to be either mono or stereo, and your mixes also to be either mono or stereo. The next over is bus config. This is where you would choose whether you want auxes or groups. You can have 12 of either auxes or groups, or you can have any variation of that up to 12. And then last is roll. This is where you can set it up as a standard console or a monitor console. You can set up your master fader to be your mix masters or to be your cue or listen level master. If you're using this as a monitor console and you have like a cue wedge, that's usually something a lot of people do so they can control that cue wedge from that master fader. The next tab down is your ganging. We talked about that when setting up the console. This is where you can gang two channels together without having it go into one channel and making it a stereo channel. Next is your network setup. When you get this console, I highly recommend putting it on your church's network or maybe a production VLAN if you have that capability. So that way people can log into this with iPads and control their mixes. You could mix from all over the room off of an iPad. This is where you would set that up. You can name the console, set your IP address. Last is users. This is where you can set certain users up. So if you share a room with maybe a youth group and you don't want them to have full access of everything, you can set up a youth group user, set up a password on it, so that way they only have access to certain things. Next button over is utility. Under general and diagnostics, we have a lot of information on the console, like what the core temperature is and the fan speed, what firmware it's running, what fader version firmware it's running. You have a calibration where you can calibrate your motorized faders. I recommend doing that about every 6 months or so. They do get thrown off after a while. Next, you have MIDI. So if you're going to use this console to control anything over MIDI, this is where you would do that. And then this last one is super cool. It's add-ons. SQ has certain plugins that you can purchase, kind of like the way you would purchase Waves plugins, but they're built into this console. So you can purchase all of these plugins for an additional cost and put them into this console without having to have any external hardware. Next one down is data. Under scenes is where you should store your specific scene. Under data is where you can store an entire snapshot of the whole console onto a USB drive. This would save all of your scenes, all of your libraries, basically everything. And so then you could recall that if something were to happen and the console were to go down. You could recall that on another console, or if you were to upgrade from an SQ5 to an SQ7 down the road, you can save all of your data to a USB drive and then push that off to the new console. Next is USB utility. This is where you would format your USB drive, also where you would do firmware updates if you had that on here. Here we also have an SQ drive. This is where you would manage what is getting sent out of the console, either to a USB stick or to a computer, either a stereo or multi-track sends. And then last we have an auto mixer. Auto mixers are super cool, especially if you have like a lot of talking heads in sort of like a TED Talk fashion. Then you can put all of your microphones into this auto mixer, and what it'll do is it'll auto adjust the gain depending on who's talking into their microphones. It's almost like using a gate, but instead of it just controlling the volume, it's actually controlling the gain. So you have less to worry about when it comes to feedback and having a bunch of open microphones on stage. I really recommend this for like panels or big group talks where you have 5 or 6 open microphones on a stage. For a band situation, it's probably not going to be very useful. As cool as it would be to have something auto mix a band for you, nothing's better than actually doing it. And then our last page is our I/O tab, and we talked about that a lot in our routing video. Go back and check that one out if you need to, but this is where you would route both your inputs and your outputs. You could also route your tie lines if you have those. And you could route those to the local inputs, to a stage rack input, to another console, to MEs, which if you don't know what those are, check out our video on the ME500s, and also to a USB or to your I/O card slot.